The offer came without warning, the way all life-altering things tend to do. One moment, Victoria Hayes was standing at the edge of the restaurant's private dining room, watching her family laugh and clink glasses beneath the amber chandeliers, and the next, she was walking toward a stranger sitting alone at the bar with the composed, deliberate stride of a woman who had made her last decision and was simply executing on it. She had built a company from nothing, by knowing exactly when to move and never second-guessing the moment. Tonight felt no different, except that she had never applied this particular instinct to anything so strange. The man was nursing a glass of water, not alcohol, which told her something. He had the kind of stillness about him that didn't belong to someone uncomfortable in his own skin. It was the stillness of a person who had long since stopped wasting energy on things that didn't require it. She sat down 2 seats away and said, quietly, without preamble, "Would you be interested in making $100 tonight?" He looked up. His eyes were dark and unhurried. He waited for more, which she appreciated. Most people filled silences poorly and told you everything about themselves in the process. "I need someone to play the role of my husband," she said. "Not just tonight. For a few months. The 100 is a gesture. There would be real compensation in the contract." He blinked once. Then, to her mild irritation, he smiled the careful, disbelieving smile of someone who assumed he was being pranked and was waiting to be let in on the joke. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and placed a folded document on the bar in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment without touching it. The party continued behind her. Her sister's laugh rose above the general noise, and someone clinked glasses again, and her mother said something that drew an appreciative chorus. Nobody had expected any of this, least of all Victoria herself, and least of all the part that came later, when the terms she had written so carefully and so coolly turned out to be the only terms she could not keep. Victoria Hayes had not chosen her life so much as constructed it, deliberately and at considerable cost, the way a structural engineer designs a bridge, accounting for every variable, stress-testing every assumption, leaving nothing meaningful to chance. She was 35 years old and the chief executive officer of Hayes Technologies, a mid-sized firm she had grown from a regional software consultancy into a $200 million enterprise in under a decade. She owned a house in the hills above the city, with more rooms than she used, and hallways that echoed pleasantly on quiet mornings, when she liked to walk the length of them before the workday began. She owned a car she almost never drove because she preferred to work during travel, and the town car allowed this. She had a reputation in her industry that other executives spent entire careers attempting to build: fair, demanding, uncompromising on quality, incapable of being charmed into a bad deal. The financial press had profiled her 3 times in 4 years. The most recent piece called her a rare breed of executive, equally admired and feared by those who work for her. She had kept a copy for exactly 1 day before throwing it away. Admiration and fear both felt like things that could be taken from you without notice, and she preferred not to build anything around either. She woke every morning at 5:15 without an alarm, which had become an automatic function of her body over years of the same schedule. She was at her desk by 6:30. She reviewed every division report personally, a practice her department heads found either reassuring or exhausting depending on their relationship with detail. She ate lunch at her desk more often than not, and she took dinner with company only when the company was professional, which was most of the time, which was something she had quietly decided not to examine too closely. She had not been in a relationship of any meaningful duration in 6 years. She had stopped counting the last one when it became clear that the man in question found her schedule more offensive than he found her compelling, that he had expected the demanding part to be a persona she could set aside on evenings and weekends, and had genuinely not understood that the demanding part was not a persona at all, but the actual architecture of who she was. She did not miss him. What she missed, on the rare occasions she was honest with herself, usually late at night, working on the second cup of coffee, was the version of herself that had briefly believed someone might choose to stay without needing her to be something different. Her mother, Eleanor, had opinions about all of this. Eleanor Hayes was a woman who had mastered the art of communicating entirely through implication, which meant that every phone call contained at least 3 references to the marital happiness of Victoria's cousins, 2 pointed observations about the passage of time, and one genuinely loving comment that somehow contained a rebuke inside it, like a pit inside a piece of fruit. Victoria had learned to hold the phone slightly away from her ear during these passages and respond with the affirmative syllables that the conversation required. Her younger sister, Amanda, had recently delivered the family's third grandchild, a development that the entire family treated with the joy it deserved and a significance that exceeded it. And the celebration had drawn 30 people to a restaurant that Victoria had reserved and paid for because arranging things well was one of the few gestures of love she had always known how to make. She stood at the edge of that party and watched Amanda glow with the particular, earned radiance of a woman who had built something she had always wanted, and she watched her mother beam and her father lift his glass, and her father-in-law make the toast too long in the way that father-in-laws do, and she felt something she could not name precisely. Not envy, she had examined it carefully enough to be sure it wasn't envy. Something more like the awareness of an absence, as though she had arranged the furniture of her life with great skill and great care and had not noticed until now that she had arranged it around an empty center, and the empty center had begun to cast a specific shadow. Then her Aunt Rosemary leaned close, smelling of the rosewater she had worn for 40 years, and said with genuine warmth and complete absence of self-consciousness, "So when are we celebrating for you, darling?" And Victoria smiled, the smile she had refined over many years into something that conveyed warmth without revealing anything, and said, "Soon," and excused herself to the quieter end of the restaurant, where the bar was, and where a man she did not know was sitting with a glass of water and a stillness she immediately recognized as trustworthy. She had not planned this. She had planned almost everything else in her life for years in advance, and this she had not planned, which meant it emerged from some more instinctive part of her. The part that had always known when a variable changed, and the model needed updating. She needed a solution. Not a partner, a solution. She was capable of reasoning about her needs with the clarity she applied to everything else. And what she needed was for the pressure to stop, and the most efficient way for the pressure to stop was to present evidence that the pressure was unnecessary. The man at the bar had steady hands and an honest face. And she was, as she would later admit to herself, with something approaching embarrassment, operating on a deadline. Daniel Carter had not planned to be in that restaurant that evening. He had been hired 3 days earlier as part of a maintenance crew contracted to inspect and service the building's climate systems, a job that had run long, as building jobs always do when the blueprints turn out to describe a slightly different reality than the walls, and which had left him finishing paperwork at the far end of the bar because the crew room was locked and his report was due before 7. He ordered water because he didn't drink when he was working, and filling out forms counted as working. He was 38 years old, had been licensed in building maintenance and systems management for 12 years, and was known among the contractors who hired him for completing work correctly the first time, which was a rarer quality than it should have been, and which generated a reliable stream of repeat business, even when the economy made everything else less reliable. His wife, Carla, had died 4 years earlier from a condition that moved faster through her body than anyone, including the doctors, had predicted possible. The grief had not destroyed him, though for the first several months it had come close enough that the distance looked like a rival. What it had done was remove all of his remaining tolerance for performance. He had none left. He could no longer summon the energy to pretend that things were easier than they were, to produce emotions for the comfort of observers, to manage how his difficulty appeared to people who preferred their difficulties managed. He had debts, the long, patient kind that accumulate from medical costs, and lost working time, and the compound interest of a single income in an expensive city. He was working on them with the steady, unglamorous consistency he applied to everything. One payment at a time. One contract at a time, as many hours as his body could sustain without becoming unreliable on the job. He had noticed Victoria before she spoke to him. It was difficult not to. She moved through the room at the edge of the party with the contained energy of someone making decisions, someone who was somewhere because she had chosen to be, and might just as easily choose otherwise. When she sat down 2 seats away and opened her mouth, he had still expected something routine. He had not expected any part of what followed. $100, a husband role, a printed contract on bar paper, He sorted through his immediate responses with the methodical patience he brought to fault diagnosis. Surprise. Yes, skepticism. Obviously. And underneath both, something he recognized as the particular relief of being spoken to honestly. She had not approached him with performance or strategy or the social warmth that people use to soften requests before revealing them. She had stated the situation. He found this completely disarming and entirely at odds with what he would have expected from a woman who appeared to own the restaurant she was standing in. He pushed the contract back without opening it. He told her no. He watched her absorb this without visible reaction and understood she was not done. She nodded once, in the manner of someone logging a data point rather than experiencing a disappointment, and left without pressing. He watched her go, and then sat for a few minutes with his water and his unfinished report, and thought about what had just happened, which was something he was still thinking about when he drove home at 8:30, and found himself unable to concentrate on the leftover soup he reheated for dinner. He was not opposed to unusual arrangements on principle. He had spent 4 years making do with whatever presented itself, reconfiguring his life around circumstances he had not chosen, and he had found that rigid principles about the shape life should take were mostly useful to people whose lives had cooperated sufficiently to be shaped. His objection to what she had proposed was simpler than principle. He did not know her, and he did not take on work for people he did not know. This was not caution about the arrangement's legality or social complexity. It was the basic reluctance of a man who had learned, at some cost, that the single most important variable in any difficult undertaking was whether the person beside you was going to be straight with you. He had no information yet. He needed information. She found him at the building 2 days later, in the East Corridor, where he was completing final checks on the third-floor units. She was carrying a revised document, and she presented her case with the precision of someone who had spent time identifying which arguments would be effective rather than which arguments she preferred. The compensation was no longer symbolic. She named a figure that represented a meaningful fraction of what he owed. The terms were clear: 3 months in total, public appearances only when required, no intrusion into private life outside the performance of their arrangement, absolute separation of genuine emotion from professional function. He would be introduced as her partner. He would attend whatever events required a partner's presence. He would be given use of the guest suite in the east wing of her residence. The contract would terminate cleanly on the date they agreed, and he would receive full payment at conclusion. She had thought of several objections he might raise and had prepared responses to them. She presented the responses before he raised the objections, which impressed him despite himself. He asked for 48 hours to consider. She said 24 was what she could allow. He called his friend Marcus that evening. Marcus, who had been his closest friend since they worked on the same building crew at 25, and who had the additional quality of giving useful advice without the need to feel that his advice had been taken. Daniel described the situation in its entirety. Marcus was quiet for a long time. "You'd be playing house with a billionaire for 90 days, he said at last. "Pretty much," Daniel said. "Is it legal?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "Is she honest?" Marcus asked. Daniel thought about the way she had placed the contract on the bar without softening the request. "I think so," he said. Marcus said, "Then you've done riskier things for less reason." Daniel said he knew. He signed the contract the following afternoon in her downtown office, across a desk that was wider than his apartment bathroom. She shook his hand with businesslike firmness. He noticed her hands were colder than her manner suggested they should be. She was already reading something on her phone before he reached the door. Living under the same roof as Victoria Hayes required a period of adjustment, and the adjustment ran in both directions. Her home was extraordinary, a modernist structure of glass and light stone that sat at the top of a hillside and caught the late afternoon sun in a way that made the whole west wall appear to be lit from within. Daniel moved into the guest suite with a single bag and a box of books, with the firm intention of occupying as little of her life as possible. This lasted exactly 36 hours. On the second morning, he found a cabinet hinge in the kitchen that had come loose from the frame, a simple job, 10 minutes with the right bit, and fixed it before he'd thought about whether to ask. Victoria came home at 8 that evening, opened the cabinet, paused, and looked at the hinge for a moment in the way she looked at things when she was updating her understanding of them. She said nothing, neither did he, but something in the quality of the silence changed. Their first public appearance was at her mother's house in the western suburbs, a Sunday dinner to which Victoria had always come alone, and at which Daniel now appeared as her partner of several months. He chose the gray jacket from the 3 options she had quietly left on the kitchen island. It was the only one he could move his shoulders in, and sat through the introductions with the calm of someone who did not require the room to like him in order to be comfortable in it. Eleanor asked him questions in rapid succession for 30 minutes. Where he'd grown up, what he did, whether he had family nearby, whether he enjoyed the city. He answered all of them honestly. When he told her he worked in building maintenance, there was a small beat. He registered it and did not react to it, and then Eleanor said, "What a practical thing to be good at," and it was the warmest compliment he had ever received from someone who was also slightly disappointed, which was a specific and impressive achievement. He ate everything on his plate. He sought out the woman who had cooked the meal and told her it was excellent, and asked about the spice blend she had used on the chicken, because he genuinely wanted to know. Eleanor mentioned this 3 times before the evening was over. Victoria watched all of this from across the table and felt something she could not easily label. She had steeled herself for an evening of active management, monitoring what he said, redirecting what needed redirecting, maintaining surfaces. She had none of this to do. He was simply present, with an ease that was not performed and not obtained by needing anything from the room. And the room responded to it the way rooms always do when they encounter someone who isn't performing. Her cousin Rachel found Victoria near the dessert table and said, in a careful undertone, "He's not what I expected." Victoria said, "No," and did not add anything else, because she did not yet know how to explain that she was not sure what she had expected, only that, whatever it was, he was something different. The following weeks accumulated their share of awkward moments. He misread the dress code at a charity event, not badly, but visibly, and arrived in a jacket that was correct in type and slightly informal in formality, which in that particular room meant something to the people who kept track of these things. He addressed the wife of a board member by first name before they had been formally introduced, which was technically a social error, and which the board member's wife visibly found refreshing. He helped a catering staff member retrieve a dropped tray at a corporate reception, and then stood with her for nearly 10 minutes discussing the layout of the kitchen and whether the station placement made sense ergonomically, which it did not. Victoria had learned, by the 3rd event, to walk slightly ahead of him at such moments, not to distance herself, but to allow herself time to arrange her expression. By the 4th event, she had stopped needing to do this. By the 5th, she had recognized what she had previously been arranging her expression against was the impulse to laugh, which was information. She began watching him with the specific attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to understand. She noticed that he knew the names of everyone who worked in her household, and that he knew them because he asked and remembered, not because it was professionally useful to him. The groundskeeper, an older man named Harold, who had worked the property for 7 years, lit up when Daniel appeared in the garden and launched into an assessment of the irrigation timer's inconsistency with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for an interested audience. Daniel listened, asked questions, and returned 2 days later having researched the model. The woman who cleaned the West Wing, whose daughter was in her final year of university, received regular inquiries about the daughter's progress and gave them with obvious pleasure. Priya, Victoria's assistant, stopped, visibly bracing herself, when she entered rooms where Daniel was present, which Victoria noticed and filed as evidence. There was one afternoon that she returned to many times in her thinking afterward, though it had seemed, in the moment, almost unremarkable. One of the junior analysts on her team had sent a report with a significant error, the kind of error that cascaded through 3 downstream calculations and produced a set of recommendations that, had they been acted upon, would have caused the company embarrassment at minimum and financial loss at worst. The analyst was 24 and had been with the company for 7 months, and had, until this error, been performing above the expectations that had accompanied his hire. Victoria had reviewed the report on a Friday afternoon and was composing her response, measured but direct, as her responses to errors always were, when Daniel appeared in the doorway of the study with coffee. He saw the expression on her face and said nothing. Just set the coffee down and turned to leave. She found herself saying, without fully deciding to, "One of my analysts made a serious error." He paused. He asked what kind. She explained briefly. He was quiet for a moment, and then asked, "Is it the first time?" She said it appeared to be. He said, "Then it's a teaching moment, not a termination conversation. He already knows he made it. The question is whether he learns it's survivable." She looked at him. He said, "People learn more from the second chance than from the first failure. The second chance is where the actual lesson is." He left. She sat with her unsent response for a while, then rewrote it. The analyst in question, years later, would become one of her most reliable department heads, which was a fact she was aware of and never mentioned to Daniel, and thought about more than she expected to. The kitchen late at night became, without planning, a kind of neutral ground. She came in at 11 one Tuesday for leftover rice eaten standing at the counter, because the idea of doing anything more deliberate was beyond her after the day she'd had, and he was already there reading something and made eggs without asking and without making anything of it. She sat down. She told him about the company she had tried to build at 26, the one that had failed quietly, embarrassingly, in a way that the investors had been very kind about, which had somehow felt worse than anger would have. She told him how she had rebuilt herself around that failure, and what it had cost, and what it had given her. He listened all the way to the end. He said that kind of experience either broke a person or became their whole foundation, and asked her which it had been. She told him. Then she asked which it had been for him. And he told her about Carla not asking for anything from the telling, not wrapping it in the softening language people use when they want you to be comfortable with their grief, rather than actually present for it, just stating what had happened, and what it had cost, and what had remained. The kitchen was very quiet afterward. Neither of them moved to fill the quiet with anything. This was, she realized later, the first conversation she could remember in years in which she had been fully present for all of it, rather than partly composed and partly preparing for what came next. She began, in the following days, to tell him other things not because she had decided to, but because the habit formed, without her noticing the way habits do when the conditions are right. She told him about the year her company came close to failing, because a key investor pulled out without warning, and she had spent 3 months working 20-hour days to rebuild the funding from alternative sources, telling no one how close it had been, carrying the specific loneliness of a person who cannot let anyone else see the load, because seeing it would make it heavier. He said, "Who helped you?" She said, "No one." "That's the point." He said, "Is it still the point?" She didn't answer immediately. He didn't push. She thought about it for the rest of the evening, and didn't arrive at an answer that satisfied her, which was itself an answer of a kind. He told her things too about the years immediately after Carla's death, when he had worked himself into a kind of functional numbness that he had mistaken for recovery, and that had lasted until a friend sat him down and said, with the bluntness of genuine friendship, that grief was not the same as being over grief, and that he was going to have to actually feel it at some point, or he would be numb forever. He said he had been angry about this, and then had understood it was true, and had spent about 6 weeks in a state that was not pretty, and then had emerged, imprecisely, into something that resembled himself. She said, "How did you know when you were through it?" He said, "I started noticing things again, small ones first." She thought about that for a long time. She started to anticipate those evenings. She became aware of doing this, analyzed it with the honest rigor she applied to any data, and produced the explanation that she was a person who valued consistency and that the arrangement had provided a structured domestic environment that her habituated mind was simply responding to. This explanation was serviceable for about 2 weeks. Then she noticed she was checking the time in the late afternoon differently than she used to, noting when 6 o'clock approached with something that was not quite impatience, and not quite relief, and was in the general neighborhood of looking forward to something. She added this to the explanation. She was adapting to a changed schedule, and the brain adapts to schedules, and this was simply adaptation. The explanation held for another 10 days. Then Gregory Ashworth appeared. Gregory was 42, wealthy in the comfortable, inherited sense, recently single in the way that made him both eligible and motivated to demonstrate eligibility. He was handsome, carefully so, in the way of men who have always been told they are handsome and have organized their routines accordingly. He understood Victoria's world because he had been born to its edges and had spent a career moving toward its center, which meant he could speak its language without effort and navigate its customs without instruction. Her mother mentioned him at Sunday lunch as a thought that had just occurred to her, which it had not. Her uncle mentioned him at a firm dinner 3 days later. The implication, which acquired mass each time it was repeated, was that Gregory was a natural fit, known, stable, accomplished in the right directions, someone who would not require explanation or accommodation or any of the adjustments that genuine difference between two people always requires. Victoria agreed to a brief coffee meeting to retire the subject. The way she sometimes approved a low-stakes proposal, simply because the cost of the discussion was higher than the cost of the proposal itself. She sat across from Gregory for 40 minutes and found him exactly as pleasant and exactly as insufficient as she had expected. He was fluent and easy, and said the right things at the right moments, and she felt, throughout, the mild warmth of a conversation that demanded nothing and offered nothing, and would leave no trace whatsoever in the space behind her sternum. She drove home from the coffee meeting with a very clear head. She sat in the car outside her house for a moment longer than necessary. Then she went inside. That evening she mentioned the coffee meeting to Daniel in the same tone she used for completed items on a professional checklist. He was reading in the living room a technical manual, as was often the case, and he looked up and said, "Good, that makes sense," in the voice of someone who had arrived at a conclusion in advance and was confirming it. He returned to the manual. She stood in the doorway of the living room for 4 seconds longer than necessary, and then went to her study and sat at her desk without opening the laptop. She sat there for several minutes. She had a great deal of practice with honest self-assessment, and she applied it now with some discomfort. The thing she felt in response to his mild, accepting that makes sense was not relief, and it was not indifference. It was the precise and unwelcome feeling of watching someone step aside for you when you did not want them to. He was withdrawing. Not with drama, there was nothing dramatic in him. She had understood this early, but with the quiet discipline of someone honoring a contract. He was reminding himself, in all the small visible ways, of what the terms were and what they were not. She understood this. She understood it accurately, with the same capacity she used for reading financial structures and identifying the assumptions underneath them. And the part of her that understood it correctly was engaged in a sustained disagreement with the part that wished, with more force than she had felt about anything outside her professional life in years, that he would stop. The calendar brought the deadline with the efficiency of a contract term, because it was one. She watched it approach without rescheduling anything. And she told herself this was because she was honoring what she had agreed to. And this was true, and it was also true that she was waiting to see what she felt as it arrived. She wanted information. She watched herself approach the end of the 90 days, the way she sometimes watched herself in a difficult negotiation, with the detached clinical interest of a person observing a process they are simultaneously inside of. What she observed was not reassuring. She found it difficult to concentrate on things that ordinarily consumed her completely. She read the same paragraph in a board report 3 times, and retained almost none of it on the third read. She stood in her office late one afternoon, looking out at the city, and was not thinking about anything that had to do with the city, or the company, or any of the 17 decisions that required her attention that day. His payment processed automatically through accounting. The guest suite contained, discreetly, the things a person needs when preparing to leave. He had signed a lease on a new apartment. He mentioned this without emphasis, as information she might need to know for logistical reasons, and had taken a new contract starting the following Monday. He was organized. He had always been organized. She had simply not, in the early weeks, understood that his capacity for orderly exits would one day feel like something she was on the other side of. She told herself she was tired. She told herself the disruption to her household schedule had generated an emotional response that would resolve once the schedule normalized. She sat in her study the evening before his final day and read through the contract from beginning to end. She had not read it since signing it with the concentrated attention she gave to documents that mattered. Every clause was clear. Every term was fair. She had written them. They said nothing about the possibility that a woman who had spent 15 years engineering her life to need nothing she couldn't produce herself might need something. The clauses were silent on this. She closed the document and sat very still for a while. His last morning was quiet in the way that certain mornings are when everyone in the room knows what is not being said. She came downstairs later than usual. She had been awake since before 5, lying in the unfamiliar position of someone who has stopped pretending to try to sleep and he had coffee made. He poured her a cup before she asked, in the automatic way of someone who had learned a person's habits without intending to. He mentioned the hinge in the east hallway that still needed attention, and the irrigation timer that Harold should look at before dry season, and 2 other small items he had noticed and not yet addressed. She sat at the kitchen island and did not write any of it down because she was not attending to the information. She was attending to the way he spoke steady, specific, present and counting, without quite meaning to, the remaining occasions on which she would hear it. He thanked her after breakfast, directly and without cushioning. He said the arrangement had been fair. He said she had been straightforward with him from the beginning, which was what had made it easy to be straightforward back. He said he hoped the situation with her family would settle. He meant everything he said. She could always tell when he meant things, which was almost always, and the sincerity of it produced a pressure in the back of her throat that she recognized, with some alarm, as the precondition for tears, which she had not shed in front of another person in 11 years. He carried his bag downstairs at 10:30. He moved through her front hallway the way he moved through every space he had ever occupied, without apology, without announcement, without the performance of occupying space at all. He set his bag down at the front door and turned to offer his hand. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about the rice on the counter and the eggs he had made without asking, and the quiet kitchen after he had talked about Carla. She thought about Harold and the irrigation timer, and Priya in the doorway, and the gray jacket that fit wrong, and about the specific blankness she had felt for 40 minutes across a table from Gregory Ashworth, and the specific opposite of that feeling that she had carried home in the car and sat with. She thought about 90 days that had moved faster than she had ever known 90 days to move. She did not take his hand. She said, "Don't go." The words sat in the hallway between them, exact and unadorned. He went very still, the stillness she had recognized at the bar, the one that meant processing rather than reacting. She pressed on, because she had never failed to press on once she had committed to a direction, and she was not going to stop now at the first genuinely important juncture she had reached in years outside of a boardroom. She said she was aware that what she was about to say was outside every term they had agreed to. She said she had spent 2 weeks attempting to identify which specific element of their arrangement she had become attached to, expecting to find something manageable, a household rhythm, a social convenience, a pleasant routine she could replace with another routine. She had not found that. She had found, with the clarity of a clean audit, that she was attached to him not to his function within their arrangement but to the person performing it, to the way he listened without waiting for his turn to speak, to the way he repaired things, not because anyone commissioned the repair, but because the broken state was unnecessary, to the way he treated every person in a room with the same quality of attention regardless of what that person could do for him, which was the rarest thing she had ever witnessed operating at such consistent scale, to the fact that he had never, in 90 days, looked at her success as something to manage or compete with or perform against. She said she had been building things for 15 years and was very good at building, and had not understood until recently that she had been building around a vacancy rather than toward anything, and that she was no longer interested in doing that. Daniel stood with his hand still extended for a moment. Then he lowered it. He was quiet long enough that she began, with the professional reflex of a person who prepares for every contingency, to assemble the phrases she would use to acknowledge rejection and recover the room, and make what came next easier for both of them. Then he said, quietly, "I've been telling myself the same thing in different words for 2 months." He said he had made a decision sometime in the 3rd week, clear-eyed, he believed, and probably correct in principle, that the distance between his life and hers was not a gap he could bridge by wanting to, that she would eventually see it as an obstacle, regardless of how either of them felt in the present moment, and that it was better to let the contract end cleanly than to ask her to navigate something she had not agreed to. He said he had been very disciplined about maintaining this conclusion. He said, with the careful understatement of a man reporting the results of an experiment that had not produced its intended outcome, that the discipline had not worked. She asked if he was staying. He said yes. She said good, and turned and walked toward the kitchen, because she needed a moment, and also because there were 2 items on the kitchen island she needed to write down before she forgot them. He picked up his bag, set it beside the staircase, and followed her without being asked. The months that followed were not simple, but they were clear. Eleanor Hayes received the news with a warmth that was 3 parts genuine, and 1 part the relief of a long concern finally set down. Daniel met the family properly this time, as himself rather than in the role of himself, and found this required very little adjustment from what he had been doing. Victoria's uncle on the board remained cautious for 6 weeks, until a quarterly report made caution appear unnecessary. The board adjusted its position on the relevance of her personal life, in the way institutions always do quietly, without acknowledgement, as though they had never thought otherwise. The company continued. Victoria worked the same hours and made the same quality of decisions. The difference that Priya noticed first, because assistants always notice first, was harder to name than a change in productivity or performance. Victoria was less inclined to treat anything that took time as a failure of preparation. She was more patient with process. She still reviewed every report personally, and she still took her professional obligations with complete seriousness. But she took dinner at the kitchen island now, and she did not check her phone during it, and the conversations that happened there were long and not always useful in the practical sense, and she did not appear to hold this against them. Daniel continued his work, on his terms, with his characteristic absence of performance about any of it. He took a role as lead supervisor at a building management firm work that suited him, and that he neither minimized nor elevated in his own accounting of what he did. He attended events with Victoria when she wanted company, and stayed home when she needed to work. And he understood the difference without being told. He repaired the hinge in the east hallway within a week of unpacking for the 2nd time. He and Harold developed a genuine friendship over the course of a single season, the way such friendships form between people who share practical knowledge and no agenda. He read his manuals in the living room in the evenings. And sometimes, she sat in the same room, and worked, and said nothing for an hour. And neither of them found anything in this to explain or apologize for. They were married in the spring, in the garden of Eleanor's house in the western suburbs, because Eleanor had asked for this with unusual directness, and Victoria had said yes without deliberation, which was its own kind of evidence of who she was becoming. The event was small by the standards of what she could have arranged. She had attended enough large gatherings, organized around demonstration rather than experience, to understand that scale and meaning did not necessarily share the same address. The guest list was 40 people. The flowers were Eleanor's choice, and were slightly more abundant than Victoria would have chosen, and were perfect. The food was prepared by the same woman who had cooked the first dinner Daniel had attended, whose spice blend he had inquired about that evening, and who had prepared the menu this time in consultation with him, which Eleanor mentioned to 3 separate guests with visible delight. Daniel wore the gray jacket again, the same one from the first dinner, and offered when Victoria noticed and raised an eyebrow. No explanation as to whether this was sentiment or practicality. She filed it in the category of things about him she had learned to stop needing to classify. She walked toward him through the garden in the spring light, through the gap in the 2 rows of chairs that her mother had arranged with unnecessary precision, and she watched his face as she approached, and saw the expression she had been given no preparation for. Not the expression of a man performing the happiness that a wedding requires, but of a man recording exactly what he was seeing, storing it with the care he gave to things he intended to keep. She saw it, and recognized it as the most honest thing anyone had ever done in her presence. And she walked toward it the way she had once walked across a restaurant bar without looking back, without second-guessing the moment, on the strength of the single most reliable instinct she had ever acted on in her life. Eleanor cried, which she had announced in advance she absolutely would not do. Amanda cried, which surprised no one. Harold the groundskeeper attended as a guest, Daniel had insisted, briefly, but with a clarity that settled the matter immediately, and stood near the back, looking pleased in the way of people who know something others are still learning. Marcus, Daniel's oldest friend, gave a toast that was 3 minutes long and contained, at the precise center of it, one sentence that made the room go quiet in the good way. "He is the most honest person I have ever known." And she is exactly what happens when an honest person meets someone worth being honest with. Victoria, who had not expected the toast to produce anything in her, sat very still for a moment and then smiled at Marcus in the way she reserved for people who had done something she genuinely respected. There was no contract. There were no terms, no sunset clauses, no enforceable conditions. No consideration paid across a wide desk. There was no fixed end date and no governing provision for what happened when two people who had agreed to pretend discovered, with mutual and inconvenient and entirely welcome certainty, that they had stopped pretending sometime in the 4th week, without either of them noting the exact moment it happened. The company continued. Victoria worked the same hours. Her decisions remained as sound as they had ever been, perhaps sounder, because she had stopped making them from a place of controlled isolation, and had started making them from a place that had some actual ground under it. The board did not notice this distinction. Priya noticed it. Harold noticed it. The junior analyst who had made the serious error and been given the second chance noticed it, years later, when he understood what the alternative would have been. Small changes. Taken individually, they might have meant nothing. Together they described a person who had built, finally, towards something rather than around the shape of its absence. Daniel continued his work. He took a supervisory role that suited him, read his manuals in the evenings, fixed things that needed fixing in the house, on the hill, and in all the other buildings he was responsible for, and did not consider any of this beneath him, because he had never operated on a framework that required such consideration. He and Harold finished the irrigation system project together over 3 weekends in the fall, and stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of two people who have made something work correctly, which is one of the better feelings available to people who pay attention to things. He cooked on Tuesday nights. He did not always cook well, which Victoria noted, and he accepted the note with equanimity. He called Marcus twice a week. He remembered the birthdays of people who did not expect to be remembered and sent brief, appropriate messages, which those people received with more feeling than he probably intended. One evening in late autumn, they were sitting on the hillside terrace, watching the city settle into darkness below them, a view Victoria had lived with for 3 years without sitting still long enough to actually receive, and she said, without preamble, that she had been thinking about what she was building toward. She said it the way she said important things, directly, as a factual statement she wanted him to have. She said she had spent a long time assuming that what mattered was what could be measured, revenue and margin and market position, and the profile in the financial press, and the opinion of people who understood the specific kind of success she had achieved. She said she still believed those things mattered, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise because that would be dishonest. But she said she had become aware recently that she was measuring them against a much longer horizon than she used to, that she was thinking, more and more, about the quality of the time between now and the end of her tenure at the company she had built, and what that time would feel like to be inside. He listened. When she finished, he said he thought that was a reasonable thing to be thinking about. She laughed, the real one, the one that had surprised her the first time it happened at her mother's dinner table, and had become, in the intervening year, the sound she associated most reliably with being exactly where she was supposed to be. Victoria had built her life with great skill and left one room dark. A man who charged $100 and asked for nothing else had walked in, found the switch, and stayed. She had offered him a temporary arrangement and a set of expiring terms. He had given her, without contract and without condition, the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable weight of someone who chose, every morning, to stay, and who had never, not once, asked her to be smaller than she was in order to make room for him. That was not something any amount of money could purchase. It was not something any amount of preparation could produce. It was, as it turned out, exactly what she had been building toward all along, without knowing what to call it or where to look.